When the World War II veteran walked into the diner, the regulars buzzed with excitement. "Tell us about the war, Ace," they called out. "About the dangerous missions." He smiled, slowly took his seat, and said, "You want to know about danger? Let me tell you about the day I flew 50 feet over Tokyo, my plane loaded with bombs, knowing I might never make it home. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful tale, tell us in the comments, what city around the world are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like these need to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us keep these voices alive. Murphy's Cafe in Millbrook, Iowa, was more than just a diner. It was the beating heart of a small town where everybody knew everybody, where the coffee was always hot, and where the same weathered faces gathered every morning around the same scarred wooden tables. The place had that lived-in feel that only comes from decades of shared stories, heated debates about local politics, and quiet moments of community grief and celebration. But on this particular Tuesday morning in late September, when Captain William Ace Hartwell pushed through the glass door with its peeling paint and persistent jingle, something in the air shifted. The usual morning chatter about corn prices and the upcoming harvest festival died down to a respectful murmur. Ace was 92 years old, though he carried his age with a dignity that made you forget the number. His silver hair was still thick, combed back in the same style he'd worn since 1945. His blue eyes, though surrounded by the inevitable lines of nearly a century of living, remained sharp and alert. He moved slowly but deliberately, his carved wooden cane tapping a steady rhythm against the worn linoleum floor. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Charlie Brennan from his usual spot at the counter. Charlie ran the town's only barbershop and had been cutting hair in Millbrook since before most folks could remember. Look who decided to grace us common folk with his presence. Charlie's comment drew chuckles from around the diner, but they were warm chuckles, the kind reserved for someone the whole town held in quiet reverence. Ace didn't venture out much these days. His modest house on Maple Street, with its perfectly maintained garden and American flag that flew rain or shine, was where he spent most of his time. But when he did make one of his rare appearances at Murphy's, it was like a small event. Martha Kowalski, who had owned the diner for the past 15 years after buying it from the Murphy family, practically sprinted from behind the counter. Martha was a sturdy woman in her early 60s, with graying brown hair always pulled back in a practical bun, and hands that had served thousands of cups of coffee and plates of pie. She had a particular soft spot for Ace, ever since he'd helped her son Danny through some trouble a few years back. "Captain Hartwell," she said, using the formal address she always insisted upon, despite Ace's repeated requests to just call him by his first name. "Your usual table." She gestured toward a corner booth that offered a clear view of the entire diner. It wasn't officially reserved for Ace, but by unspoken agreement, nobody else ever sat there when he was around. "That'd be fine, Martha," Ace replied, his voice carrying the slight rasp that comes with age but still retaining the crisp diction of his military training. "And please, how many times do I have to tell you? It's just Ace, not in my establishment," Martha replied with mock sternness, sliding the coffee pot from its warming plate. "You earned that title, and by God I'm going to use it." As Ace settled into the red vinyl booth, the diner's other patrons began to migrate in his direction. It wasn't a conscious thing. Nobody had declared it Captain Hartwell's story time, but it happened every time he came in. Something about his presence drew people. Tommy Peterson was the first to approach. At 16, Tommy was lanky and awkward in the way that teenage boys often are, all elbows and enthusiasm. His sandy brown hair fell across his forehead in a way that made him constantly push it back, and his hazel eyes held that mixture of curiosity and impatience that marked him as someone eager to understand the world beyond Millbrook's borders. "Mind if I sit, Ace?" Tommy asked, already sliding into the booth across from the old pilot. "Course not, son," Ace replied, wrapping his weathered hands around the steaming coffee mug Martha had placed in front of him. "How's your father doing? Still working at the grain elevator?" "Yes, sir," Tommy nodded. "Dad talks about you sometimes, says you flew in the big war, says you shot down 15 enemy planes." Ace's expression grew thoughtful. 15 confirmed, he corrected gently. "Could have been more, but in the heat of battle, you don't always know for certain what happens to every plane you fire at." By now, several other regulars had drifted over. Sarah Mitchell, the postmaster's wife, was a thin woman with prematurely gray hair and intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing. She'd moved to Millbrook from Des Moines 5 years earlier and was still working to earn her place in the community's intricate social hierarchy. "Ace," she said, settling into a chair someone had dragged over from another table. "My husband's always talking about wanting to hear more of your war stories. He was too young for World War II and missed Korea because of a heart murmur. Always felt like he missed out on something important." Charlie had left his post at the counter and joined the growing circle, along with Dr. Raymond Foster, who'd been the town's only physician for 37 years. Dr. Foster was a compact man with silver-rimmed glasses and the kind of calm demeanor that comes from delivering babies and comforting the dying with equal grace. "We've all heard bits and pieces over the years," Dr. Foster said, adjusting his glasses. "But you've never really told us about the dangerous missions, the ones that made the papers." Ace took a slow sip of his coffee, and for a moment, his eyes seemed to focus on something far beyond the diner's walls. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the old warrior's face, highlighting the network of lines that spoke of years spent squinting into bright skies and distant horizons. "You know," Ace said finally, his voice taking on a different quality, quieter, more measured. "You folks always want to hear about the dogfights, the air-to-air combat, the excitement of it all." He paused, rotating his coffee mug slowly between his hands. "But let me tell you about a different kind of danger. Let me tell you about the day when every single one of us knew we were flying what might very well be a suicide mission." The circle around Ace's table had grown larger. Even Martha had stopped her constant bustling to lean against the counter and listen. The diner had fallen into that particular kind of silence that precedes a story everyone knows will be worth hearing. "April 18th, 1942, Ace began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone that suggested the weight of memory. "The Doolittle Raid. You might have read about it in history books, seen it in movies, but what they don't tell you in those sanitized versions is what it felt like to be there. What it felt like to know that every decision you made in the next few hours might be your last." Tommy leaned forward, his teenage restlessness forgotten. "The Doolittle Raid? I think I read about that in school. You bombed Japan, right?" "We did more than bomb Japan, son," Ace replied. "We did something that everyone said was impossible. We launched heavy bombers from an aircraft carrier, flew them further than they were designed to fly, and struck at the heart of an empire that thought itself untouchable." Ace paused to take another sip of coffee, gathering his thoughts. Around him, the small crowd waited with the kind of patience that comes when you know you're about to hear something important. "I need to give you some context first," Ace continued. "This was 4 months after Pearl Harbor. 4 months since the Japanese had caught us with our pants down and sunk half our Pacific fleet. The American people were scared, angry, and demanding action. President Roosevelt himself wanted to hit back at Japan, to show them and the world that America wasn't down for the count." Sarah shifted in her chair. "But Japan was so far away. How could you reach it?" "That was exactly the problem," Ace nodded. "Our long-range bombers were based in places like Australia and India, thousands of miles away from Japanese cities, and even our aircraft carriers couldn't get close enough to Japan to launch conventional attacks without getting themselves sunk by Japanese submarines and land-based aircraft." Charlie stroked his chin thoughtfully. "So, how'd you do it?" Ace's eyes took on a faraway look. "A man named Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle came up with a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane, depending on how you looked at it. Maybe both." He leaned back in the booth, his hand still wrapped around his coffee mug. "Doolittle figured that if we could modify some B-25 Mitchell bombers, make them lighter, give them extra fuel tanks, we might be able to launch them from an aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet. The idea was to sail the Hornet to within about 400 miles of Japan, launch the bombers, hit strategic targets in Japan, and then fly onto airfields in China where we could land and refuel." Dr. Foster pushed his glasses up his nose. "That sounds reasonable enough. What made it so dangerous?" Ace let out a dry chuckle. "Everything, Doc. Absolutely everything." He set down his coffee mug and began counting on his fingers. "First, B-25s were never designed to take off from aircraft carriers. They were too heavy, too big, and needed too much runway. Second, we'd be flying at the extreme limit of our fuel capacity. One strong headwind or navigational error, and we'd be swimming in the Pacific. Third, we'd have no fighter escort and no way to call for help if things went wrong. And fourth," he paused for effect, "nobody had ever successfully launched bombers that big from a carrier deck before. We'd literally be making it up as we went along." Tommy's eyes were wide. "And you volunteered for this?" "We all did," Ace replied simply. 80 men, 16 crews, Every single one of us knew the odds were against us, but we also knew that somebody had to do it. America needed to hit back, and we were the only ones crazy enough to try. Martha had moved closer to the table, the coffee pot forgotten in her hand. What was your job on the mission? I was a bombardier, Ace explained. My job was to aim and drop the bombs once we reached our targets. But on a crew of 5 men, everybody had multiple responsibilities. I was also the belly gunner when we needed defensive fire. He gestured with his hands, sketching out the layout of an aircraft. Our pilot was Lieutenant Jack Morrison, 23 years old, from a small farm town in Nebraska, not unlike this one. Steadiest hands I ever saw on a stick. Our co-pilot was Lieutenant Danny Kowalski. Yes, Martha. Same last name as you, though I don't think you're related. Martha smiled at this. Our navigator was Sergeant Mike Chen, a Chinese-American kid from San Francisco who could find his way across an ocean using nothing but dead reckoning and prayers. And our radio operator was Corporal Eddie Sullivan, an Irish kid from Boston who could fix anything with electronics and had a joke for every situation. What were they like? Sarah asked softly. Ace's expression grew warm with memory. They were good men, the best. Jack was quiet, methodical, the kind of pilot who checked and double-checked everything. Danny was the opposite, loud, funny, always trying to keep everybody's spirits up. Mike was brilliant, absolutely brilliant with numbers and calculations, but shy as anything. And Eddie ... Ace chuckled. Eddie could talk the paint off a barn, but when things got serious, he was all business. Dr. Foster leaned forward. How long did you train for the mission? 3 weeks, Ace replied. 3 weeks to learn how to do something that had never been done before. We practiced takeoffs from a simulated carrier deck painted on a runway at Eglin Army Airfield in Florida. The deck simulation was 450 feet long, shorter than a real carrier deck because they wanted to be sure we could handle the worst-case scenario. He shook his head at the memory. Those first few attempts were terrifying. A B-25 normally needs about 1,200 feet of runway to get airborne. We had 450 feet. Do the math. Tommy was scribbling notes on a napkin. How'd you manage it? Stripped everything we could out of the planes to make them lighter. Removed the belly turret guns. That's why I ended up being both bombardier and belly gunner. Installed extra fuel tanks everywhere we could find space. Modified the engines for maximum takeoff power. And then we practiced and practiced and practiced until we could get those birds off the ground in less than 400 feet. Charlie whistled low. Still sounds impossible. It nearly was, Ace agreed. Even after all that modification and training, we were still operating at the very edge of physics. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, one gust of wind at the wrong time, and it would be all over. The old pilot paused to take another sip of coffee, his eyes distant with memory. Around him, the small crowd waited in rapt silence. On April 1st, 1942, we loaded our 16 B-25s onto the USS Hornet in San Francisco Bay. It was quite a sight. All those big bombers strapped down on the carrier deck, wingtip to wingtip. The Navy boys kept shaking their heads, saying it couldn't be done. Sarah leaned forward. Were you scared? Ace considered the question carefully. Scared? No, not exactly. Nervous, yes. Excited, definitely. But when you're young and trained and part of something bigger than yourself, fear isn't the dominant emotion. It's more like focused intensity. Every sense heightened, every detail sharp and clear. He gestured around the diner. You have to understand, we were all volunteers. Nobody forced us to go. We went because we believed in what we were doing, and because we trusted each other completely. When you have that kind of faith in your crew and your mission, it changes how you face danger. Dr. Foster adjusted his glasses again. What was the atmosphere like on the ship? Tense, Ace replied immediately. For 16 days, we sailed across the Pacific, not knowing exactly when we'd launch, or even if the mission would go forward. The Navy couldn't tell us much because they didn't know themselves what we'd encounter. Japanese submarines were everywhere, and we all knew that if the Hornet was attacked, our bombers would go down with the ship. He paused, remembering. We spent our time checking and rechecking our equipment, studying maps of Japan until we could navigate the target areas blindfolded, and trying to stay calm. Eddie Sullivan organized poker games to keep everybody's minds off the waiting. Jack Morrison read every technical manual he could get his hands on. Mike Chen calculated and recalculated our fuel consumption down to the last gallon. What about you? Tommy asked. What did you do? Ace smiled slightly. I wrote letters. Letters to my parents back in Iowa. To my girl Margaret, who later became my wife. To my brother, who was serving in the army in Europe. I wrote them knowing I might never get the chance to mail them. Martha wiped her eyes with her apron. Did you? Mail them, I mean? Some of them, Ace replied quietly. The ones I wrote after we made it to China. He straightened up in the booth, his military bearing reasserting itself. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the day itself. The circle around Ace had grown even larger. Word was spreading through Millbrook that the old pilot was finally telling one of his war stories, and people were finding excuses to stop by Murphy's Cafe. The morning coffee crowd had been joined by folks who should have been at work, housewives who had abandoned their grocery shopping, and even a few teenagers who had somehow heard about the gathering. April 18th dawned gray and rough, Ace continued. We were about 650 miles from Japan, further than we'd planned, because the Hornet task force had run into a Japanese patrol boat the night before. Admiral Halsey, who was commanding the operation, had to make a choice: launch immediately, even though we were too far out, or abort the mission and sail back to Hawaii. Charlie leaned forward. What did he decide? He chose to launch, Ace replied, which meant we'd be operating at the absolute limit of our fuel range. There would be no margin for error, no room for mistakes. Ace's hands began to move as he spoke, sketching shapes in the air to illustrate his story. The Hornet was pitching and rolling in heavy seas. Waves were breaking over the bow, and the wind was gusting up to 40 miles per hour. Taking off from a carrier deck in perfect conditions was difficult enough. Taking off in a storm was, well, let's just say it concentrated the mind wonderfully. He paused, his eyes focusing on something beyond the diner walls. I remember walking out to our plane. We called her Ruptured Duck because of the cartoon painted on her nose, and seeing the deck crew struggling to keep the other bombers tied down in the wind. The Hornet was pitching so badly that sometimes the deck would drop away beneath your feet, and sometimes it felt like the whole ship was going to roll over. Tommy was hanging on every word. How did you take off in those conditions? Very carefully, Ace replied with a slight smile, and with a lot of prayer. Jimmy Doolittle's plane was first off the deck. He insisted on leading by example. We watched from our cockpit as his B-25 rolled down that impossibly short deck, the carrier pitching beneath him like a wild horse. Ace's hands demonstrated the motion. The key was timing. The pilot had to start his takeoff roll just as the ship's bow began to rise on a wave, so that by the time you reached the end of the deck, the bow would be pointing up, giving you that extra few degrees of lift angle. Sarah had stopped breathing. Did Doolittle make it? Barely, Ace replied. His plane dropped below the level of the flight deck after takeoff, disappeared from sight for a few seconds while everyone held their breath, then climbed back into view. One by one, the other crews followed. Every takeoff was a small miracle. Dr. Foster was shaking his head. And you were next? We were number 14, Ace said, which meant we got to watch 13 other crews either succeed or... He didn't finish the sentence. By the time it was our turn, the wind had picked up even more, and the seas were getting rougher. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering. Jack Morrison was ice-cold calm, the way he always was in a crisis. He went through his pre-flight checklist one more time, even though we'd already checked everything twice. Danny Kowalski was cracking jokes from the co-pilot seat, trying to keep everybody loose. Mike Chen was hunched over his navigation charts, calculating wind drift for the 1,000th time. And Eddie Sullivan was testing the radio, making sure we'd be able to communicate with the other planes once we were airborne. What were you thinking? Martha asked quietly. Ace opened his eyes and looked directly at her. I was thinking about home, about Iowa cornfields and Sunday dinners and all the normal, peaceful things I might never see again. But I was also thinking about Pearl Harbor, about all the American boys who died there, and about how this was our chance to hit back. He took a deep breath. Jack fired up the engines, and the whole plane started vibrating. B-25s were loud under normal circumstances, but on that carrier deck, with the wind howling and the engines at full power, it was deafening. Jack looked back at all of us, made sure we were ready, then gave the deck crew the signal. Ace's hands gripped the edge of the table as if he were still in that cockpit. The first thing you notice is the acceleration. A carrier deck catapult wasn't like the hydraulic systems they use today. It was just a matter of releasing the brakes and hoping you could build up enough speed before you ran out of deck. How fast did you need to go? Tommy asked. At least 95 miles per hour, Ace replied. In 450 feet, while the deck was pitching and rolling beneath you, and with a 40-mile-per-hour headwind that could shift direction without warning. He shook his head at the memory. I was watching the deck markers flash by outside my window, counting off the feet. 100, 200, 300. At 400 feet, Jack pulled back on the stick, and for one terrible moment, I thought we weren't going fast enough. The plane lifted off the deck, but we were barely flying. More like controlled falling. Sarah had her hands pressed to her mouth. Did you make it? We dropped about 50 feet below the carrier deck level, Ace said quietly. For about 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours. We were flying through the wave troughs, with walls of water on both sides of us. I could see the faces of the sailors on the Hornet's deck, watching us disappear. Then Jack got the nose up, the engines caught their second wind, and we started climbing. He smiled slightly. Eddie Sullivan came on the intercom and said, "Well, boys, I guess we're really doing this." That was Eddie. Always had to have the last word. Charlie was shaking his head in amazement. "And you still had to fly all the way to Japan?" 650 miles over open ocean, Ace confirmed, flying at about 200 feet above the waves to stay under Japanese radar coverage. No radio contact with the other planes because we were maintaining radio silence. No way to know if our navigation was accurate until we reached the Japanese coast. Dr. Foster leaned back in his chair. That must have been nerve-wracking. "It was the longest 6 hours of my life," Ace agreed. We flew in loose formation with the other B-25s, close enough to see each other, but spread out enough so that if one plane had engine trouble, it wouldn't take down the others. Mike Chen was constantly checking our position, using dead reckoning and celestial navigation because we couldn't risk using the radio beacon. He gestured toward the window. "Imagine flying over an ocean that looks the same in every direction, with nothing but your compass and your calculations to tell you where you are. No GPS, no satellites, no modern navigation aids. Just the sun, the stars, and a lot of hope that your math was right." Tommy was scribbling furiously on his napkin. "What happened when you reached Japan?" Ace's expression grew more serious. "That's when the real danger started. We'd been flying for about 5.5 hours when Mike Chen came on the intercom and said, 'Land ahead.' Looking out the window, I could see the Japanese coastline rising out of the morning mist." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You have to understand, this was the Japanese home islands. This was territory that no Allied aircraft had ever reached before. For all we knew, there could be hundreds of fighter planes waiting for us, thousands of anti-aircraft guns, radar stations that had somehow detected our approach. Were there?" Sarah asked. "Some," Ace replied. "But here's the thing about flying at 200 feet. You're below most radar coverage, and you're moving so fast that visual spotters don't have much time to react. We came in fast and low, following valleys and ridge lines to mask our approach." His hands moved again, demonstrating flight paths. "Our target was an aircraft factory on the outskirts of Tokyo. Jack brought us down to about 50 feet. So low I could see people in the streets looking up at us. Some of them were waving because they couldn't believe that American planes had reached their homeland." Charlie whistled. 50 feet? That's barely above the rooftops." "Exactly," Ace nodded. "We were flying between buildings, under power lines, around water towers. One wrong move, one moment of inattention, and we'd have been a crater in downtown Tokyo." He took another sip of coffee, his hands steady despite the intensity of the memory. I was hunched over my bomb sight, trying to line up on the target while Jack flew the most dangerous flying of his life. The aircraft factory was spread out over several city blocks, with multiple buildings and smokestacks. "How did you know which building to hit?" Dr. Foster asked. "Intelligence photos," Ace replied. "We'd studied those target photos until we could identify every building, every landmark. But looking at a photo is one thing. Trying to recognize those same buildings while flying 50 feet off the ground at 200 miles per hour is something else entirely." His expression grew intense with the memory. "I had maybe 30 seconds to identify the target, line up the bomb site, and release our bombs. Miss the target, and the whole mission would be a failure. Hit civilian areas by mistake, and innocent people would die." Martha was gripping her coffee cup so tightly her knuckles were white. "What happened?" "I found the target," Ace said simply. "Jack held the plane steady as a rock while I lined up the shot. At exactly 12:15 p.m. local time, I released our bombs and said, 'Bombs away, Jack. Let's get the hell out of here.'" The small crowd around the table was completely silent, hanging on every word. "That's when all hell broke loose," Ace continued. "Air raid sirens started wailing all over Tokyo. Anti-aircraft guns opened up from every direction. And somewhere behind us, I could hear the sound of fighter plane engines starting up." Tommy leaned forward. "Fighter planes. Zeros," Ace confirmed. "Japanese fighter planes. Faster than us, more maneuverable than us, and flown by pilots who knew the local terrain like the back of their hand." and we were still 1,000 miles from the nearest friendly territory. He rubbed his forehead, as if trying to ease an old headache. Jack put the nose down and we headed for the deck, flying as low and as fast as that old B-25 would go. The idea was to get out of Japanese airspace before their fighters could organize a proper pursuit. Did it work? Sarah asked. Ace's expression grew grim. For about 20 minutes it did. We were flying just above the treetops, following the Japanese coastline south toward our planned route to China. I thought we might actually make it clean away. He paused, looking around the circle of faces. That's when I heard Eddie Sullivan's voice on the intercom, and there was something in his tone that made my blood run cold. He said, "We've got company, boys. 4 zeros. Coming up fast from behind." The silence in the diner was so complete that you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I grabbed my machine gun and crawled back to the belly gunner position. Ace continued. The belly of a B-25 has a small window and a mount for a .50 caliber machine gun. It's not much protection, but it was all we had. His hands moved as if he were still gripping that gun. Looking out that little window, I could see the 4 Japanese fighters closing in on us. They were flying in perfect formation, and they were gaining fast. Jack was pushing our engines to the limit, but a B-25 just can't outrun a Zero. Charlie was leaning so far forward, he was almost falling out of his chair. "What did you do?" "The first Zero came in from directly behind us," Ace said, his voice taking on the clipped, precise tone of someone recounting a combat action. "The pilot was good. He stayed right in our wake, where it was hardest for me to get a clean shot at him. But he made one mistake. He got impatient." Ace's eyes were focused on something far beyond the diner walls. Instead of staying back and pecking away at us with long-range fire, he closed in for a killing shot. When he got to about 200 yards, I could see his face through his cockpit canopy. He was young, couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, and he was concentrating so hard on lining up his shot that he didn't see me swing my gun around. "You shot him down," Tommy whispered. Ace nodded slowly. "I opened fire when he was about 150 yards away. The .50 caliber bullets hit his engine, and I saw pieces of metal fly off his cowling. His plane started smoking, then burning, and then..." He paused. "Then it went down." The old pilot's hands were trembling slightly now, and Martha quietly refilled his coffee cup. "That's when the other 3 Zeros got serious," Ace continued. "They stopped playing games and came at us from 3 different directions at once. There was no way I could engage all of them with one gun." He looked directly at Tommy. "This is the part they don't show you in the war movies, son. In real combat, it's not about heroics or clever tactics. It's about survival, and sometimes survival means making impossible choices." "What kind of choices?" Dr. Foster asked quietly. "Jack Morrison made the choice," Ace replied. "He came on the intercom and said, 'Hold on, boys. We're going to do something stupid.' Then he pushed the nose down and dove for the deck, not 50 feet above the ground, but 10 feet, maybe less," Sarah gasped. 10 feet? Jack flew that B-25 like it was a fighter plane," Ace said, his voice filled with admiration even after all these years. "We were flying between hills, around buildings, under bridges. I could see people on the ground diving for cover as we roared overhead." He shook his head in amazement. "The Zeros couldn't follow us down that low. They were going too fast, and the terrain was too dangerous. One by one, they had to pull up and break off their attack runs." "So you escaped?" Charlie asked. "We thought we had," Ace replied. "For about an hour, we flew low-level across southern Japan, staying below the radar and avoiding the major cities. Mike Chen kept us on course for China, and our fuel situation was, well, it was tight, but manageable." He paused for another sip of coffee. That's when Eddie Sullivan came back on the intercom, with news that none of us wanted to hear. He'd been monitoring Japanese radio frequencies, and he could tell from the chatter that they'd scrambled every available fighter in southern Japan to hunt for us. Tommy had stopped taking notes and was staring at Ace with wide eyes. "How many fighters?" "We never knew for sure," Ace replied. But Eddie counted at least 8 different aircraft radio call signs, and that was just what he could pick up on our limited radio equipment. Could have been dozens more. The weight of this information settled over the small crowd. Dr. Foster removed his glasses and cleaned them nervously. The plan had always been to fly across the East China Sea and land at airfields in China, controlled by the Chinese nationalist forces, Ace continued. But that meant another hour and a half of flying over open water, with our fuel running dangerously low and half the Japanese Air Force looking for us. He gestured toward the window. Imagine being in a car with an almost empty gas tank, driving through territory where everyone wants to kill you, with no idea whether the gas station you're aiming for actually exists or has been destroyed by the enemy. Martha wiped her eyes again. I can't imagine the stress. The funny thing is, Ace said with a slight smile, once we were actually in combat, the stress almost went away. There's something about being in immediate danger that focuses the mind wonderfully. You stop worrying about all the things that might go wrong and concentrate on the things you can control. He looked around the circle of faces. Jack Morrison was the steadiest pilot I ever flew with. Danny Kowalski kept us informed about our engine status and fuel consumption down to the minute. Mike Chen navigated us across that sea using nothing but a compass and his calculations. And Eddie Sullivan monitored every radio frequency, giving us advance warning of Japanese fighter patrols. What was your job during all this? Sarah asked. I kept watch, Ace replied simply. From my position in the belly of the plane, I could see in almost every direction. My job was to spot enemy fighters before they spotted us and to give Jack enough warning to take evasive action. He paused, remembering. About halfway across the East China Sea, I saw something that made my heart stop. 6 specks on the horizon, coming toward us fast. At first I hoped they might be Chinese aircraft, but as they got closer, I could see the rising sun markings on their wings. Charlie was gripping the edge of his chair. More Zeros? 6 of them, Ace confirmed. And this time, they'd learned their lesson. Instead of coming straight at us, they split up into 3 pairs and came at us from different altitudes and directions. Classic fighter tactics. His expression grew grim. Jack saw them coming and did the only thing he could do. He headed for a cloud bank about 5 miles away. If we could reach those clouds before the Zeros reached us, we might be able to lose them in the weather. Did you make it? Tommy asked breathlessly. Almost, Ace replied. We were about a mile from the clouds when the first pair of Zeros caught up with us. I opened fire as soon as they came into range, but they were smart. They stayed just outside the effective range of my machine gun and peppered us with cannon fire. He touched his left shoulder unconsciously. That's when I got hit. A 20mm cannon shell exploded just outside my gun position and sent shrapnel through the aircraft's skin. Nothing serious, just enough to remind me that this wasn't a training exercise. Martha gasped and moved closer to the table. You were wounded? Barely scratched. Ace waved off her concern. But it meant I couldn't operate the belly gun effectively anymore. Jack was on his own for defensive maneuvering. He flexed his left shoulder, as if the old wound still bothered him on cold mornings. That's when Jack Morrison proved why he was one of the best pilots in the Army Air Corps. With 6 enemy fighters closing in on us, and our defensive armament compromised, he flew that B-25 like it was a single-seat fighter. Ace's hands moved in complex patterns, illustrating aerial maneuvers. He threw us into a diving spiral that would have torn the wings off a lesser aircraft. The G-forces were incredible. I was pressed against the floor of the plane so hard I could barely breathe, but it worked. The Zeros couldn't match our dive speed, and by the time they adjusted their attack, we were in the clouds. Dr. Foster leaned forward. How long could you stay hidden in the clouds? Not long enough, Ace replied grimly. Clouds over the ocean are usually thin and scattered. We had maybe 10 minutes of cover before we'd have to break clear again. And our fuel situation was becoming critical. He paused to take another sip of coffee, his hands steadier now as he settled back into the rhythm of the story. Mike Chen was working frantically with his charts and slide rule, calculating our remaining range. The numbers weren't good. Even if we encountered no more enemy fighters, even if the wind stayed favorable, we were going to be flying on fumes by the time we reached the Chinese coast. Tommy was scribbling calculations on his napkin. How much fuel did you have left? Maybe 90 minutes worth, Ace replied. And we were still at least 2 hours from the nearest friendly airfield in China, which meant we were probably going to have to ditch in the ocean or make an emergency landing in enemy territory. The circle around Ace had grown even larger as word continued to spread through Millbrook. The morning shift at the grain elevator had apparently decided to take an extended coffee break, and several farmers who should have been checking their fields had found urgent business at Murphy's Cafe. But we weren't giving up, Ace continued, his voice taking on that particular tone of stubborn determination that had carried him through the war. Jack pushed our engines to maximum cruise power, trading fuel efficiency for speed. The idea was to reach Chinese territory as quickly as possible, even if it meant we'd be running on empty when we got there. He looked around the expanded circle of listeners. This is where the story gets interesting in a different way. See, we weren't just trying to survive anymore. We were racing against time to complete our mission. Sarah tilted her head. I thought you'd already completed your mission when you bombed the aircraft factory. That was only part of it, Ace explained. The real strategic value of the Doolittle Raid wasn't the physical damage we caused. 16 bombers can only carry so many bombs. The real value was psychological. We wanted to prove to the Japanese people and their military that their homeland wasn't invulnerable. But for that to work, some of us had to make it to safety and tell the world what we'd accomplished. Charlie nodded slowly. So if you all got shot down or captured, the mission would have been a failure, even if you'd hit your targets. Exactly, Ace confirmed. Which is why Jack Morrison was pushing that plane beyond its design limits to reach China. Every mile we flew was another mile closer to getting our story out. He gestured toward the window again. When we finally broke clear of the clouds, we could see the Chinese coastline ahead of us. But we could also see something else. Smoke trails from the 6 Zeros, still hunting for us about 5 miles behind. The tension in the diner was palpable. Even people who had wandered in just to eavesdrop were now completely absorbed in the story. That's when Mike Chen saved our lives, Ace continued, his voice filling with respect for his long-dead crewmate. He'd been studying the geography of the Chinese coast, and he spotted something the rest of us had missed, a weather front moving in from the west. Tommy looked up from his notes. What kind of weather front? A thunderstorm, Ace replied. A big one, the kind that spawns tornadoes and microbursts and lightning that can fry an aircraft's electrical system. Under normal circumstances, any sane pilot would fly around a storm like that. Dr. Foster was beginning to understand. But these weren't normal circumstances. Mike came on the intercom and said, "Jack, if we fly into that storm, the Zeros won't be able to follow us. Their aircraft aren't built for severe weather flying," Ace recounted. And Jack, without hesitating for even a second, said, "Hold on, boys. We're going into the storm." Ace's expression grew distant as he remembered. Flying into a thunderstorm in a B-25 is like riding a bucking bronco while someone throws rocks at you and sets off fireworks in your face. The turbulence was so severe that we were thrown around the cockpit like rag dolls. Lightning was flashing all around us, and the rain was so heavy I thought it might strip the paint off our wings. Martha was gripping her coffee cup with white knuckles. "How did you survive it, Jack Morrison?" Ace said simply. That man could fly anything with wings through anything nature could throw at it. For 20 minutes, he wrestled that B-25 through wind shears and downdrafts that should have torn us apart. And when we finally broke through the other side of the storm, we were alone. Charlie let out a breath he'd been holding. "The Zeros gave up? They couldn't follow us through weather like that," Ace confirmed. Japanese fighter planes were built for speed and maneuverability, not for flying through thunderstorms. So they turned back, and we were finally clear of immediate danger. He paused for effect. Of course, now we had a different problem. We were over Chinese territory, but we had no idea whether we were over areas controlled by Chinese nationalist forces, Japanese occupation forces, or local warlords who might shoot first and ask questions later. The complexity of the situation was beginning to dawn on his listeners. This wasn't just a story about aerial combat. It was about navigation, diplomacy, and survival in a war zone where the battle lines were constantly shifting. "And our fuel was almost gone," Ace continued. "Mike Chen calculated that we had maybe 15 minutes of flying time left. We needed to find an airfield immediately, or we'd be making an emergency landing in hostile territory." Tommy was hanging on every word. "Did you find an airfield?" "We found something better," Ace replied with the first genuine smile he'd shown since beginning the story. "We found the Flying Tigers." Dr. Foster blinked in surprise. "The American volunteer group? I thought they were based in Burma." "Some of them were," Ace confirmed. "But they had detachments all over southern China, including a forward base at an airfield called Chuchao. And as we were flying over what we hoped was friendly territory, running on fumes and praying for a miracle, we heard the most beautiful sound in the world." He paused dramatically. Eddie Sullivan picked up a radio transmission, in English, an American voice saying, "Unknown aircraft approaching from the east. Identify yourself or we'll blow you out of the sky." The relief in Ace's voice was evident, even after all these decades. Jack grabbed the radio microphone and said, "This is Army Air Corps B-25 number 40-2344, part of the Doolittle Task Force. We just bombed Tokyo and we're almost out of fuel. Please tell me you're the good guys." Charlie was grinning now. "What did they say?" There was a long pause, Ace recalled. And then this voice came back and said, "Well, I'll be damned. You boys actually pulled it off. Follow me down. We've got a runway cleared for you." The small crowd around Ace's table broke into spontaneous applause, as if they were celebrating something that had happened in real time instead of 8 decades ago. "2 P-40 Warhawks appeared off our wingtips," Ace continued. Flown by American pilots who were officially volunteers with the Chinese Air Force but were really U.S. Army Air Corps on detached duty. They escorted us to the airfield at Chuchao, where we landed with literally fumes in our tanks. Martha wiped tears from her eyes. You made it. You actually made it. We made it, Ace confirmed. But not all of the other crews were so lucky. Of the 16 B-25s that launched from the Hornet, only one landed at its designated airfield in China. The rest either crash-landed, were shot down, or had to ditch in the ocean when they ran out of fuel. The celebration in the diner died down as the reality of the mission's cost became clear. What happened to the other crews? Sarah asked quietly. Ace's expression grew somber. 3 men were killed in crashes. 8 were captured by the Japanese. 3 of those were executed, and the others spent the rest of the war in prison camps. The rest of us were scattered across China, trying to make our way back to friendly territory. He paused, honoring the memory of his fallen comrades. But here's the thing that's important to understand. Even with those losses, the mission was a success. Not because of the physical damage we inflicted on Japan, that was relatively minor, but because we proved that the Japanese homeland wasn't invulnerable. Dr. Foster nodded thoughtfully. It changed the psychology of the war. Exactly, Ace agreed. Before the Doolittle Raid, the Japanese military and population believed that their island nation was protected by divine intervention. After the raid, they knew that American bombers could reach them. It forced them to keep fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft guns in Japan to defend against future attacks, instead of sending those resources to the front lines. Tommy looked up from his notes. What happened to your crew after you landed? We spent 3 weeks in China, Ace replied, being moved from airfield to airfield by Chinese nationalist forces who were trying to keep us away from Japanese patrols. It was like being in a spy movie, traveling at night, hiding during the day, never staying in one place for more than a few days. His expression grew warm with memory. The Chinese people we met were incredible. They risked their lives to help us, even though they knew the Japanese would execute anyone caught harboring American airmen. We owe them a debt that can never be repaid. Martha refilled his coffee cup again, her hands trembling slightly. How did you finally get home? Eventually, we made contact with American forces in India, Ace explained. The Army flew us out on a transport plane, and we ended up back in the United States about 6 weeks after the raid. By then, the story had already made headlines around the world. Charlie leaned back in his chair. You were heroes, Ace shook his head. We were soldiers doing our jobs. The real heroes were the men who didn't make it back, and the Chinese civilians who died helping us. He paused, his expression growing more serious. There's something else about that mission that I've never talked about publicly, something that's haunted me for 80 years. The diner fell silent again, sensing that Ace was about to share something deeply personal. Remember I told you about shooting down that first Zero, Ace said quietly, about seeing the pilot's face through his cockpit canopy. Tommy nodded, his pen poised over his napkin. He was just a kid, Ace continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Couldn't have been more than 22 years old, and in that split second before I opened fire, I could see that he was scared, not of dying, scared of failing his mission, of letting down his squadron. Ace's hands were trembling now, and Martha reached over to steady his coffee cup. I've thought about that boy every day for 80 years, he said. I've wondered about his family, his dreams, his plans for after the war. I've wondered if he had a sweetheart waiting for him. Parents who never learned what happened to their son. Sarah was crying openly now. Ace, you had no choice. It was war. I know that, Ace replied. Intellectually, I know that if I hadn't shot him down, he would have shot us down. I know that we were fighting for freedom and democracy against fascism and militarism. I know that what we did was necessary and right. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your heart are two different things. That boy was somebody's son, somebody's pride and joy, and I took him away from them. Dr. Foster leaned forward. Have you ever tried to find out who he was? Ace nodded slowly. After the war, when relations between the U.S. and Japan normalized, I started researching Japanese military records. It took me years, but I finally found him. His name was Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka. He was 23 years old, from a small farming village outside Osaka. He had a wife and a baby daughter. The silence in the diner was profound. Even the background noise of the coffee machine and the fluorescent lights seemed muted. In 1985, Ace continued, I traveled to Japan. I found his village, found his family. His wife had remarried, but his daughter, who was a grown woman by then with children of her own, agreed to meet with me. Martha was crying now, too. What did you tell her? I told her that her father was a brave pilot who died defending his country, Ace replied. I told her that he fought with honor and that his sacrifice wasn't forgotten, and I apologized for taking him away from her. Charlie's voice was hoarse when he spoke. What did she say? She thanked me, Ace said simply. She said that for 43 years, she'd wondered how her father died, whether he suffered, whether he was afraid. She said that knowing he died quickly, in aerial combat against a worthy opponent, gave her peace. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a small, faded photograph. She gave me this. It's a picture of Lieutenant Tanaka with his wife and baby daughter, taken just before he shipped out to his fighter squadron. The photograph showed a young Japanese man in military uniform, standing beside a woman in traditional dress who was holding a small child. The man was smiling, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he knew he might not be coming home. I've carried this picture for 37 years, Ace said. It reminds me that even in war, even when we're fighting for the most important causes, there's always a human cost. Every enemy soldier is somebody's son, somebody's father, somebody's hero. Tommy was staring at the photograph with wide eyes. Do you regret shooting him down? Ace considered the question carefully. I regret that it was necessary, he said finally. I regret that young men like Hiroshi Tanaka and Jack Morrison and Danny Kowalski had to die for the freedoms we enjoy today. But I don't regret doing my duty, and I don't regret serving my country. He looked around the circle of faces. That's the lesson I want you to take from this story. War isn't glorious. War isn't exciting. War is young people dying for causes they believe in, on both sides. The goal should always be to avoid war if possible, but when it becomes necessary, to fight it with honor and to remember the human cost. Dr. Foster was cleaning his glasses again, his hands shaking slightly. What happened to the rest of your crew? Jack Morrison came home and became a commercial airline pilot, Ace replied, his voice growing warmer as he shifted to happier memories. He flew for United Airlines for 35 years and raised 4 kids. We stayed in touch until he died in 1987. Danny Kowalski went back to school on the GI Bill and became an engineer. He helped design some of the early NASA rockets. Mike Chen became a mathematics professor at UC Berkeley. And Eddie Sullivan, Ace smiled. Eddie went into radio broadcasting. He had his own show in Chicago for 20 years. Martha wiped her eyes with her apron. Did you all stay friends? We had a reunion every year until the last of them passed away, Ace confirmed. Crew bonds forged in combat don't fade with time. We were brothers, in the truest sense of the word. Charlie was shaking his head in amazement. And you never talked about the mission until today? Oh, we talked about it, Ace replied. Among ourselves, but not publicly. The military kept the details classified for years. And by the time the records were declassified, we'd gotten used to keeping our own counsel. He paused, looking around the expanded crowd that now filled most of Murphy's Cafe. I'm telling you the story now because I think it's important for people to understand what previous generations went through to preserve the freedoms we sometimes take for granted. Tommy looked up from his notes. Do you think something like the Doolittle Raid could happen again today? Ace shook his head. Not exactly like it. Modern warfare is fought with different weapons, different tactics, but the principles remain the same. Courage, sacrifice, brotherhood, and the willingness to do what's necessary to protect what you believe in. He stood up slowly, his joints protesting after sitting in the booth for over an hour. The important thing isn't the specific details of what we did 80 years ago. The important thing is that each generation finds the courage to face its own challenges with the same spirit. As Ace prepared to leave, the crowd in the diner began to disperse, but slowly, reluctantly, as if they were afraid that by leaving, they might lose some part of the story they'd just heard. Martha approached the booth where Ace had been sitting. Captain Hartwell, she said formally, would you be willing to come back and tell us more stories? About the war, about your crew, about what it was like? Ace considered her request carefully. I don't know, Martha. Today was difficult. Bringing up all those memories, talking about things I've kept private for decades. Dr. Foster stepped forward. Ace, with respect, I think you have an obligation to share these stories. Not for our entertainment, but for education, for history. Several people in the crowd nodded agreement. Sarah Mitchell spoke up. My husband teaches history at the high school. He'd love to have you come talk to his students. Kids today don't understand what your generation went through, Charlie added. They need to hear these stories from someone who was there. Ace looked around at the faces surrounding him. Farmers and shop owners, teachers and retirees. teenagers, and grandparents. All of them were looking at him with a mixture of respect, gratitude, and expectation. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "But I want you to understand something. If I do this, if I start telling these stories publicly, it won't always be comfortable. War isn't a Hollywood movie. It's messy and complicated and morally ambiguous. Are you prepared for that?" Tommy stood up from the booth. "Yes, sir. We need to know the truth, even if it's uncomfortable." Ace studied the young man's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, son. I'll think about it." As Ace made his way toward the door, people stepped aside respectfully, but many of them reached out to shake his hand or pat his shoulder. The barber, Charlie, stopped him near the exit. "Ace," Charlie said quietly, "I just want you to know what you and your crew did, what all of you did in that war. It mattered. It still matters." Ace gripped Charlie's hand firmly. "Thank you, Charlie. That means more than you know." As the old pilot stepped out into the bright Iowa morning, the bell above Murphy's cafe door chimed one last time. Behind him, the conversations gradually resumed, but they were different now, more subdued, more thoughtful. Martha began clearing the coffee cups from around the booth where Ace had sat, but she left one cup untouched, the one he'd been drinking from. Instead, she placed a small handwritten sign next to it, reserved for Captain William Ace Hartwell, American hero. Tommy Peterson sat in the booth for several more minutes, staring at his napkin full of notes and trying to process everything he'd heard. Finally, he stood up and walked to the counter where Martha was working. "Mrs. Kowalski," he said, "would it be okay if I wrote about this? For the school newspaper?" Martha looked at him seriously. "Only if you get it right, Tommy. Only if you tell the truth about what war really costs." "I will," Tommy promised. "I'll make sure people understand." As the morning wore on and Murphy's Cafe gradually returned to its normal rhythm, word of Ace's story continued to spread through Millbrook. By evening, it seemed like everyone in town had heard at least a version of what the old pilot had shared. But for those who had been there, who had sat in that circle and listened to Ace Hartwell recount the most dangerous day of his life, the experience had been transformative. They had witnessed something rare and precious, the passing of history from one generation to the next, not through textbooks or documentaries, but through the living voice of someone who had been there. And in a small Iowa town where the biggest excitement was usually the annual corn festival, that was something worth remembering. 3 days later, Tommy Peterson's article appeared in the Millbrook High School newspaper. It was titled "The Day We Bombed Tokyo," a local hero's story, and it was the most read piece the school paper had ever published. But more importantly, it was accurate, honest, and respectful, a faithful retelling of Ace's story that captured both the heroism and the human cost of the Doolittle Raid. Within a week, the article had been picked up by the regional newspaper, and within a month, it had caught the attention of military historians and World War II enthusiasts across the country. Suddenly, Captain William Ace Hartwell found himself receiving letters and phone calls from people who wanted to hear more of his stories. But that's a story for another day. For now, it's enough to know that on one Tuesday morning in Murphy's Cafe, an old warrior finally found the courage to share his truth with the world. And in doing so, he reminded everyone who heard him that freedom isn't free, that heroes aren't perfect, and that the most important stories are often the ones that are hardest to tell.